My name is Alan Tomlinson. I'm a resident of Washington, D.C., but on 9/11/2001, I was in Oslo, Norway. Today is 9/26/2002. 8 months before 9/11, in January, I lost two very close family members, my brother-in-law and my great-aunt. And I bring them up because both of them were very closely connected to both New York City and Washington, D.C., as well as they were two of the closest people in my life, in my family and in my life. My brother-in-law was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and always regarded New York as his home. But in his middle adult years, he moved to Washington, D.C. My great-aunt went to Columbia University, got her master's, taught in New York City, and also eventually moved to Washington, D.C. Having lost both of them almost days apart in January of 2001 hit me very hard. And I felt that that was as much as of anguish as I ever wanted to feel in such a brief outburst. On the weekend of September 9th, 2001, I was having a gathering with the rest of my family locally, and we were talking about how much we missed both of these individuals. And I remember remarking that 2001 had dealt us enough anguish for the rest of the year, and nothing else needed to occur for this to be felt, for me to feel that this was one of the worst years of my life. But not trying to be maudlin about it, I had already planned to leave on September 10th, Monday night, out of BWI Airport for a pleasure trip to Oslo, Norway. This was taken in part to live up to some urgings of both my brother-in-law and my great-aunt, who both were world travelers, and both felt that that was one of the best educations and resources that anyone could ever avail themselves to. So by taking on this trip, with the sense of loss very much in my heart, I felt it was going to be a sense of serenity or a retreat to get away to the mountains and the beauty and the grandeur of Norway and to have nothing else to think about. Well, when I left here on 9/10 in the evening out of BWI, when I walked through security, I had just a random thought as I worked my way through security of how poorly and how lax security was. And I remember just having this silly thought in my head of, well, I hope this doesn't bode ill will for tonight's flight or anything like that. And it was just one of these random thoughts. I got on the plane the next morning on 9/11/2001. I landed in Oslo, Norway at 2:46 their time, which was 8:46 East Coast time. At the same time, the first tower was being hit. As I deplaned and I picked up my rental car, I had no knowledge of anything back on the East Coast. It was an absolutely gorgeous day in Oslo, just like it was here. And as I picked up my rental car and I was chatting with the rental agent, we talked about nonsense. But we had no inkling of what was happening back here on the East Coast. When I got into my rental car and I started heading towards the city of Oslo, driving down the highway, I turned on the radio, just out of habit, knowing there would be Norwegian news and I wouldn't be able to understand anything they were telling me. I almost immediately picked up the DJ's sense of urgency in his voice, and you could, even without understanding the words, you knew that something had happened. As I listened, to the best of my ability, I kept hearing him use the phrases World Trade Center, American Airlines, Twin Towers, New York City, and I could not fathom what he was talking about. It just didn't make any sense, and the best I could come up with was there was a near miss. But his urgency and the tone of his voice was that something was still occurring and that things were unfolding as he spoke. So, being very confused by what I was listening to, as I pulled into Oslo to try to find my hotel, I was so transfixed on the radio that I ended up missing my turn. Got myself a little lost. Ended up trying to find my way back to my hotel. I saw a policeman. So as I pulled over to ask the policeman for directions, as he walked towards the car, he asked me if I was an American. And I said, yes, I am. He asked, do you know what's happened back in your country? And I said, not really. I don't know if I understand. Something's happened in New York. And he said, yes, your two trade center towers have been hit by airplanes. And I just thought, no, that's absurd. That wouldn't happen. And the worst I could think of was small general aviation planes. And they probably just hit and bounced off. It didn't make any sense with the news report, but I thought maybe the news reporter had just been exaggerating or embellishing. And the policeman said, no, I'm serious. Your towers are on fire. In fact, if you notice, do you realize where you're sitting right now is in front of the American Embassy. And if you look up, you'll notice that it's closed and it's surrounded by policemen and barriers. It's closed, and actually you need to be driving away from here right now. We are very concerned. That obviously spoke volumes. And at that point, he helped me get back to my hotel. I got into the hotel lobby, and the young lady at the desk started off by asking if I knew what was happening back in the U.S. And I said, certainly, I understand the World Trade Center has been hit by airplanes, but I'm still confused as to what's really happening. And she went on to say, not only your trade towers, but also your building called the Pentagon. She said it very haltingly, not even really knowing what the word meant. And I very almost arrogantly said, no. No one touches the Pentagon. You never hit the Pentagon. Local lore has it that building is just off limits to anybody. And again, I'm still thinking of general aviation. It's not sinking in that these were commercial planes. So she goes, no, it really is, there's a fire there, and you really should go upstairs to your room and watch the TV where you can see what's happening. Well, I went up to the hotel room, turned on what I thought was going to be CNN, and it didn't come on screen. And for a fleeting moment, I thought, okay, New York has been hit, the Pentagon has been hit, and the Atlanta broadcast tower for CNN has been hit. So definitely I'm getting kind of caught up in the moment. When I call downstairs, she goes, no, I'm very sorry. It turns out that our satellite dish is not working, so you'll have to watch Norwegian news, which is like CNN. It's just the Norwegian version. So I flipped on that channel, and it was a reporter in New York on the roof of a building, and behind him you could see the trade towers burning. They started replaying the tape of the second plane over and over. And on the tape, as most people probably have seen too many times, the plane, because of the proportion of the distance, looks very small. And it's kind of hard to tell that it's a full-size commercial jet until you see the collision with the second tower and you realize, okay, that's severe, and that's as bad as it really is. At that point, it's now about maybe 10 minutes of 10 East Coast time. I tried to start calling back to friends and family here in D.C. and the New York area. And I kept getting the same recorded message that all phone lines to the U.S. were down or unavailable or busy, etc. And, of course, I'm thinking, maybe it's worse than even I'm seeing on TV. At that point, I realized that maybe I could try and make a phone call beyond the East Coast, and I called my parents in Durham, North Carolina, where my father said, yes, in fact, the trade towers were hit, as I could see on TV. The image was just as good on this Norwegian station as it was for CNN or any of the other broadcast networks. But I had no images of the Pentagon, and my father said not only had that happened, but there was a fourth plane that was in Pennsylvania, and they weren't sure what the status of that one was. But that definitely there was an attack, and it was a terrorist attack. At that point, it's now about 9:58 East Coast time, and the South Tower starts to come down. At that point, my father suggests that we get off the phone and that I might want to either take it in by myself or talk to someone there at the hotel or whatever. We hang up. I watch that collapse in disbelief. And then about a half hour later, I watch the North Tower come down. Again, just not seeming real at all. Just seemed that this was a Hollywood movie, that we were watching some really perverse Hollywood stunt. It just didn't make any sense. Well, around, I guess it's now about 11 o'clock East Coast time, and by then the news is coming back fast and furious. I called downstairs again at the hotel, and she apologized again and said, if you come down to the lobby, we'll have a computer set up where you can dial CNN.com. So I came down to the lobby, and there were about six or seven other Americans down there already on the computer, along with a single Israeli gentleman. As I approached the group with the simple question of, what do we know? What's happening? The Israeli fellow jumped in with, it's Arabs. It's got to be Arabs. You know it's Arabs. And I was very defiant that no, we don't know that. After all, after Oklahoma, that was the simplistic response, and we were wrong. So the other Americans in the group were suspending judgment. They just knew that something had happened. And I leapt into that just like Oklahoma, this was something of a right-wing terrorism attack. And that in my mind, it meant that all four of these pilots were subscribers to a right-wing agenda, and that this was their way of getting retribution for Timothy McVeigh. So I had built up in my own head how this was going down, always assuming it was a domestic attack in every sense of the word. Until some of the people in the group of Americans I was talking to said, no, this just doesn't make sense. This is something different than Oklahoma. This is something, foreign to us in so many respects. And then I guess it kind of kicked in maybe later in the day that we don't really have a history of using suicide missions on in our attacks on any level. And I guess somehow intellectually I had to convince myself, even while the news was coming back from the U.S. that this was a probable attack by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, I still wanted to believe that it was somehow domestic. Until finally, I guess that night I had this just epiphany that no, I'm wrong, and that's what this really is. But I to this day I'm just sort of intrigued as to how I wanted to believe it was a homegrown attack and not a foreign attack. And I don't know if that makes it better or different, but I just wanted to believe it. So later that evening, I went to the desk and asked when the CNN news would be available to us, and she apologized and said probably the next day. But if I were to walk down to a local pub in Oslo that catered to Americans in English, they would have English language broadcasts on there. So I went down there, and they did have CNN on, but they turned the sound down. So again, I'm watching replays of the visuals, but I'm getting no other information that really helps further the story. I then go inside the pub, and they have the BBC on. And I remember being very irritated that the BBC announcers were not expressing much sympathy. They were being very cold about this whole thing. And I remember just being very, very upset that they couldn't even pretend to be upset to the level that I thought they should have been. And also was upset that people in the bar, who were mostly English, seemed to be fairly indifferent to the TV. They now, in their defense, maybe earlier in that day they had watched all they could handle. But they almost seemed to be going about their lives as if nothing had happened. So I remember getting really irritated at that and upset. But that didn't last long, because when I got back to the hotel, all the employees I met there at the counter in their restaurant extended their hands and their hearts wonderfully. And over the next 10 days, I can say the Norwegians that I met were 100% sympathetic and offering their condolences and very heartfelt. And I thought that was a very cool feeling to have them do that. The next day, on 9/12, I did get a call back to the D.C. area where I reached a very good friend here in Washington, D.C. She gave me the information that I was sort of lacking of what was happening here in town vis-a-vis the closed down shops and businesses and National Guard out and about and Humvees on the road, etc. And she explained what she was feeling and how she had been handling the day. And I guess I must have let out how frustrating it was to be overseas, that I really wanted to be home to be in this, to understand it, to witness it firsthand. And she said, look, it sounds to me like you're better off where you are. Just stay there and don't even I couldn't come home. The flights were all canceled and stayed canceled for about a week. So my trip had already been planned for 10 days, and I realized, well, I'm not going home anytime soon. I may as well just try to make this trip be what I wanted it to be, which was R&R. So I spent the next 4 or 5 days in Oslo, met a lot of nice people, played tourist as best I could, but at the end of each day I'd rush back, and eventually the CNN did come back on our TV, so I was able to follow it. By about day 3 or day 4, it's kind of when it finally hit me. And I just, in fact, I spent almost the whole day just in bed. I mean, that's the best I can say, is that it was, that was my, when it's like the 2x4 hit me in the forehead, when I realized what had happened. And I remember on that day watching the replays thinking, no, this is just some silly dream. It's something that it just didn't happen. And it wasn't until about day 5, probably Saturday, that I realized, okay, it's happened. There's nothing I can do about it. There's nothing that I can say. The feelings are valid, but I can't go anywhere with them. So at that point, I decided to go ahead and drive up into the mountains, as I originally planned, to go up and view nature in all of its splendor. So I got my car and drove up into the mountains, and for 3 days, I was completely out of touch. No TV, no telephone, nothing. Again, everyone I met couldn't have been nicer. The Norwegian people across the board were just wonderful, and kept saying things like, you didn't deserve this. This was wrong. Yes, people have a problem with your country, but this is not right. So I liked the way they were explaining themselves and how they viewed it. Finally, after about 3 days of that, I ended up coming back to Oslo, where I went back to the same hotel. And one of the nice touches they had done was, maybe it was on day 2 or day 3, they had put a fruit basket in every room of every American staying there. And with basically a note card saying, we understand, we feel how bad you feel, etc., and we wish you the best. So that was a very thoughtful thing that they did, and I thought that was a very classy thing they did. The Americans at the hotel, we bonded. We got very close. We all hung out for several days. People are getting different snippets of information back from the U.S., so it wasn't such a bad thing. To be in a foreign country, I was surrounded by Americans who were also getting information, so we all really helped each other through it. And I did eventually get a few more phone calls back to the States and talk to other friends who were expressing their sense of loss for my sake that I was overseas, and said, actually, this might have been the best thing. Maybe you're the ones because you're close by. So that's doesn't mean a whole lot, but it's just interesting how that was the kind of thing we kept talking about, was who's feeling the pain the worst? Who's handling it better? Where are you standing at this time? Finally, as the trip wound down and I came back to the States, I remember flying back into BWI, and as we landed, of course, I had a sense of relief, not so much that the plane landed, but just to be back home. And I realized that this was a very emotional connection to be back here. But it was soured right away when I walked through the airport, and I saw what I felt was not a lick of increased security whatsoever. To me, it was as benign as it's ever been, and I was so angry that every security personnel I looked at couldn't look more bored. And I thought, what have we learned? Absolutely nothing. So I came through, and I was picked up by a good friend, and he told me more information as we drove back to D.C. When I got home, on my email was an email message that had been sent out on day 2, on the 12th, by the friend that I had reached back here in D.C. She had sent a wonderful email to all of my friends and her friends with basically the message header of Alan made it okay, or Alan made it safely. And I thought that was a very cool thing she did, because she really nailed the sense of my voice that I was probably oblivious of at the time. And the sense of hurt and betrayal and loss and pain, she conveyed it beautifully, poetically. She sent the email out to about 20 other people, who then responded to that email by sending emails back to me. So in this age of email, it was quite a tool to see how quickly information got out and about to people all over the country about what things were happening here and for me overseas. Well, the thing about what I started off with was losing my brother-in-law and my great-aunt is, like I said, 2 days before this happened, I felt that I had been dealt enough pain for 1 year. Obviously not. Obviously 9/11 will always rank as one of the preeminent downer moments in our lives. And yet, I wasn't really finished grieving about my brother-in-law and my great-aunt. So here we are a year later. And what's really frustrating is that when I have a sense of loss, of pain, of mourning, I get the 2 episodes confused. It's emotionally confused. On the anniversary of 9/11 this year, of course, we're watching all the TV replays and memoriams, etc., and I'm feeling a great deal of loss and pain, tearing up. And then I'd have these flashes of my family members who had died. And it was so frustrating to want to mourn one or the other, but to not to mourn them simultaneously. Somehow that seemed cheapening them. And I'll never get over that. I'll never be able to separate them or compartmentalize them, and that's just the way it is. I mean, that's what we're, I'm gonna have to deal with. So it's just something that I will always wonder how I can give justice to the sense of mourning that I think my family members deserved, and to the victims of 9/11, and yet not make it into something maudlin or disabling. It's just a matter of, I want to give them each their respect, each incident, each loss. So to this day, I don't know what the next step will be, and I don't know if on next year 9/11 and the next year, if it'll just be a diminishing sense of loss for that. But I do know that having lost these two family members, while as sad as it was, there was a silver lining that they didn't have to see 9/11. I think for both of them, it would have been just so much more horrible than it was even for me, because of their love of New York City and their love of Washington, D.C., and because both of them were pacifists and both believed that pacifism will rule the day. And I think both of them would have been torn apart by what became evidently necessary after 9/11, the sense of payback, retribution, revenge, etc. And I have no problem with what we did. But I know that these two family members would have been very troubled by that, and would have felt that their moral and political views were not able to have full measure on when we most needed it. Was pacifism the way to handle this? Was turning the other cheek the way to handle this? I don't know. I probably think we did what we had to do. But so it's kind of odd to say, but maybe their passing when they did was the best thing to happen. So they didn't have to see this. And yet, on the other hand, I really wish they were both here so I could say, how are you handling it? How does it affect you? What do you think? But that's up to me now, and those around me. So I appreciate the time, and thank you for listening.